Yeah, and I really do. I want to say again that the role that ADUs play, the niche that they fill in the housing market, is incredibly important, right? I mean, as as an aging in place strategy, it's hard to find a better solution for somebody who wants to stay in their neighborhood. Maybe their housing costs are too high, or they can't keep up their house. ADUs are the sort of gold standard for them. If you have an adult child who you need to take care of, gold standard. If you want to stay in your neighborhood and you need to have them close.
Welcome to Dirt and Sea, where we talk all about the places and spaces of North Carolina and the people who make them awesome. I am your host, Jed Byrne. Throughout my career in real estate development, finance, commercial brokerage, engineering, and construction, I have covered just about all facets of the real estate and land use ecosystem. This show is an opportunity to not only share what I've learned with you, but to also introduce you to my friends who are doing truly transformative work and sharing their stories. With each episode of Dirt and Sea, my goal is simple. I want you to walk away learning something new about land use. I promise to keep it simple and straight to the point. If you ever have any questions for me, feel free to reach out on Twitter at OakCityCRE. Now let's jump in. So today I had the privilege of talking with Charles Dillard. Charles is an urban designer and planner with the City of Raleigh's Urban Design Center, where he is a member of an interdisciplinary team working to envision a more equitable, sustainable, and beautiful Raleigh. Drawing on his diverse background, Charles is a core member of Raleigh's effort to reimagine what our neighborhoods and public realm can be. Charles manages the city's Accessory Dwelling Unit program, a comprehensive set of regulations and incentives that will make Raleigh the Southeast's most ADU-friendly city. Prior to joining the Urban Design Center, Charles was an urban designer with Ratio in Raleigh and a planner with the New York City Department of City Planning. Charles holds a master's in city and regional planning from UNC Chapel Hill, go Heels, and a master's in landscape architecture from the University of Toronto. So today, Charles and I talk about all things ADU. We really kind of geek out for a while on the different barriers and hurdles to ADUs, the history of ADUs within Raleigh and in other markets, and talk about where we are with ADUs here in Raleigh and what we think the future looks like. We discuss, I think most importantly, the specific niche that ADUs fill as a housing type. And really, it's a housing type that has no real alternatives, which I think makes ADUs crucial to the growth of our city. We discussed the adoption rate of ADUs in other markets, and I think it's probably not what most people expect it to be. We discussed the barriers to accessory dwelling units as a type of housing and what the city is doing about those barriers. And we specifically discuss the housing affordability and anti-displacement measures that the city is exploring as ADUs roll out in Raleigh. I think this conversation is a very important one, as we are now just over a year since ADUs have been re-legalized in Raleigh. I think it's important to discuss kind of the ins and outs of accessory dwelling units and what it means to the city of Raleigh. But as always, we're going to start off with Two Truths and a Lie from Charles Dillard.
Two truths and a lie. Okay. I have been to all 50 state capitals.
Okay.
I once served bowls of curry to David Byrne of Talking Heads fame.
Okay. Bowls, plural.
Bowls, multiple bowls of curry.
Okay.
And I have walked back and forth for a few miles across a lake.
A few miles across the lake. Okay. So I'm assuming the lake was frozen.
It indeed was frozen.
Okay. So frozen lake walking, and I know you've got a connection to Canada, so I feel like that's plausible. 50 states. What was the last state capital you went to? Not the last one, like chronologically. What was number 50 on your list?
Ooh. Let's say Charleston, West Virginia.
Charleston, West Virginia, which I'm not a geography major, but I do believe that is actually the capital, so that's a good start. Pretty gold dome on their Capitol building, if
Beautiful
I recall.
capital. It is. I have to say, Unfortunately, it puts North Carolina's capital to shame.
Oh, ouch. All right.
Actually built during the Depression, surprisingly.
Okay. So built during the Depression. He's got data. He's got stats. Now, how does one? And I don't know if you use this because my last name's Byrne. I like to tell people, which is not
That's
true
right.
at all.
I didn't even think about that.
He is my long lost uncle. But so no relation to any Talking Heads fame. But how does one come across David Byrne and the opportunity to serve him curry?
Okay. So are you assuming this is a truth?
No, I'm asking.
Okay.
You were there. I wasn't.
Let's say I was waiting tables while I was an undergrad.
Okay.
In Winston-Salem, downtown, at an Indian restaurant. And let's say David Byrne was in town for, he had an exhibition at an art museum. And he was with his daughter and one of her friends, and they were in town, and they came to the restaurant, and he ordered
multiple
bowls of curry and some other things that I definitely do not remember.
So 50 state capitals, I'm going true. Lake walking, I'm also going true. I'm calling BS on the David Byrne story.
That's absolutely true.
Really?
Yeah, it was true. I was waiting tables at an Indian restaurant that is no longer existing, unfortunately, called Kebabs.
Okay.
Very excellent restaurant. And David Byrne was in town. He had a show at Sika, which is a great art museum in Winston-Salem, and super weird art that included some PowerPoint presentations that David Byrne had made. And he was with his family, and super nice guy. I saw him walk in the door, and I grabbed my boss and said, I want to wait on his table because I'm a huge Talking Heads fan. And super nice guy, really laid back, very unassuming. Obviously restrained myself a little bit, but he was great.
Didn't completely fanboy all over.
Did not.
Good.
But yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So that's I never would have guessed that. That's a fascinating story. So which one's the lie? 50 state capitals has to be true.
I've never been to. I don't think I've even been to half of this.
Really?
States,
okay.
Much less state capitals.
Okay. Yeah, you got me on that one. Have you been to
I have.
West Virginia?
I actually drove through and stayed a night in Charleston a couple weeks ago. Okay. And it was a super cool city, beautiful state capital. But no, I've never been to.
Most of them. Okay. When you go to a state, do you try to go to the state capital?
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I lived in New York State for 3 years and never stepped foot in Albany, and I'd like to see it because they've got some sort of weird modernist architecture going on there. But
I did see a picture online the other day of like their complex.
Yeah, it's similar to sort of like Brasilia. It was built I think same period of time.
And there was a plan, I think a similar plan for Raleigh, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, maybe. Raleigh is the first purpose-built state capital in the country, I believe. So Raleigh is an early version of Brasilia.
Interesting. Okay. Cool. Well, with that, now that we know a little bit more, I don't know if I'm allowed to put Talking Heads music, but that might be like the intro music if I'm legally allowed to do that. But tell me, Charles, who are you and what are you working on these days?
Yeah, so I'm Charles Dillard. I'm an urban designer with the city of Raleigh. I born and raised in North Carolina. I spent some time, about 6-7 years, up north and in Canada, and really wanted to come back to North Carolina to do urban design and planning. It was, the reason I got into this field is because I love my hometown. I love all of North Carolina's towns and cities, and thought that, coming back here was a way to make a difference and to, help the state and the community. So came back to Raleigh like 6 years ago, and I've, bounced around, been at the Urban Design Center a couple sort of stints, and spent a couple years at Ratio, which is a landscape architecture, interior design firm. And made my way back to the city where, for the last couple of years, I've been working a lot on the sort of myriad of housing initiatives that the city has going on. So missing middle housing, accessory dwelling units, tiny homes, also supporting a bunch of area and corridor studies and doing a whole bunch of everything. I'm a bit of a utility guy, I guess, around the office. So yeah, I mean, that's and how I found my way into this specific room to talk to you about ADUs.
It's a long and winding story.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, I was thinking about, how did I get to be this like expert on ADUs? My background is planning and landscape architecture. Sort of fell into this whole housing world. I love it. But I think if I had to sort of pinpoint a couple moments or periods in my career and in my life that brought me to this place, I would say that, I moved to Toronto in 2009 to study landscape architecture at the University of Toronto. And especially when I first got there and didn't know anybody, I spent a lot of my time just wandering around the city on my bike or on foot or running, and sort of very quickly gravitated to these laneways in the city. They call them alleys in the United States. They call them laneways in Canada. And Toronto just has this amazing network of laneways. It's similar to Chicago in that way. Almost every one of the residential blocks, at least in the core of Toronto, has laneways. And there are these really nice intimate spaces, almost always paved, and cutting through the middle of blocks. And
what's the alternate if it's not paved?
There are some that are still gravel.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, just a couple sort of for no apparent reason have never been paved. So that's always interesting when you're on a road bike.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it didn't take me long to realize, hey, I really like these places. And then the sort of urban designer mind started thinking, well, people should live in these places. They're really nice, intimate spaces. It's a different kind of scale from a lot of Toronto. And very quickly came to find out that I was not, by no means, was I the first person who thought laneways should be sites of housing. In fact, there's many, many people who've been dealing with laneway housing in Toronto for so long, and sort of just fell in love with laneway housing. It's a big housing issue in Toronto. I think it is very similar to the way we talk about ADUs in most cities in the United States. I think Chicago does have capacity to build housing in their alleyways. But in Toronto, it's one of the most expensive cities in North America, if not the world. And there's a shortage of housing. And, I did some studies in school and worked with some people who've done other studies that have shown that, Toronto's laneways can accommodate anywhere from, 25,000 to 80,000 housing units. And these are very similar to ADUs,
which is a percentage of what? Because I don't know how big Toronto is.
I mean, Toronto is
that 1% or is that
metro area?
10?
Toronto's population now is pushing, I want to say 5 million.
Okay,
people can
so
check that.
Much larger than Raleigh.
Much larger.
Yeah.
Toronto is one of the 2 or 3 densest cities, I think, in North America.
And is that this is not going to be the Toronto show. We're going to get to Raleigh, but I was always under the assumption that laneway houses in Toronto were always a thing. So is this a transition moment, or I mean, in your timeline?
It's been a long transition moment, just like our very own long transition moment with ADUs, if not even longer. I mean, I think people have been trying to get laneway housing sort of proliferated for 20, 30 years now. If folks want to look it up, I know we won't spend too much time on this, but there's a great architecture firm, Shim and Sutcliffe in Toronto, who the partners actually built a laneway house to live in themselves a couple decades ago, and they're sort of the flagship laneway house, and they've sort of done probably more than anybody to advocate for this issue. But anyways, back to ADU. So I fell in love with laneway housing and the sort of concept of these small houses and these intimate spaces in an otherwise sort of bustling city where you can go 5 minutes from an area that looks like Times Square to being in a really nice, tight-knit laneway with some housing in it. And it's just a nice scale. It's quiet. Some people might prefer that kind of setting.
But it gives you an option to the high-rise tower.
It does, and we'll get into this a little bit later about the sort of niche that ADUs fill in the housing supply and market that really can't be replaced by any other kind of housing. But anyways, fast forward, I took a detour in New York for 3 years. ADUs was not an issue that I thought about in New York, not really too much space for them. But came to Raleigh, and I still remember the day, it was sometime about 6 years ago. And my boss at the time, Bynum Walter, who's still doing great work for the city of Raleigh, came in and she had 2 new work assignments that needed a project manager. And one was, I think one was an NCOD somewhere in Raleigh, and the other was Accessory Dwelling Units. A group of people from Mordecai had petitioned the city to do a sort of study and a pilot program of ADUs. And I raised my hand for ADUs just because of my fascination with laneway housing. Yeah. And I wondered if there was some sort of corollary here that could connect these issues. And so that's how I got into ADUs. I started working on this project in 2015. And I worked on it through that first stint at the Urban Design Center. And then I left to go to Ratio. In those 2 years that I was sort of not in the public sector, I became a bit of an advocate in the community for ADUs and worked with a great group of people trying to make it easier to build ADUs in the city and ultimately to educate the community about ADUs. And then I came back to the city, and it turns out that ADUs are still on the table, and the city council now is very much in support of ADUs. And so we have the city has ultimately sort of fast-tracked a lot of these initiatives and programs that we and others have put forward. And so that's how I got here. That was a sort of long, rambling answer about Toronto.
How we got you, and that's how you became the Raleigh ADU expert.
This is how it happened.
But so real quick, third grade, explanation of, for folks out there who don't know, what is the Urban Design Center? I mean, what is it that you do there? Not you personally, but what does the Urban Design Center do? And again, I mean, right, so Bynum walks in with assignments, and you kind of walk through like how do those tasks come to be, and then why does the Urban Design Center exist, and what do you guys do?
So the Urban Design Center started almost 20 years ago, believe it or not, right when Raleigh's downtown was sort of experiencing this resurgence and revitalization. And at that time, and for the first, 5, 6, 7 years, it was focused almost primarily downtown. So downtown public realm, reviewing proposals for development downtown. And the Fayetteville Street project was one of, I think, the first big things that the Urban Design Center worked on. Subsequently, as Raleigh has continued to grow and growth has started occurring in other areas of the town, the city sort of broadened the scope for the Urban Design Center. And so what the Urban Design Center is, it is an office within the planning department that consists of mostly professionals who have some sort of design background. So we've got some architects, we've got landscape architects, we've got folks who are historic preservation experts, and a few of us have sort of dual backgrounds in planning and some design field. Also sort of we do a good bit of graphic design, but you can sort of think of the Urban Design Center as sort of half internal consultant to the rest of the city. So when the transportation department, for example, needs some help on the public realm design or even some renderings, we'll frequently do that. But we're also a resource for the community in that we help visualize planning concepts, urban design concepts. We partner with other departments to do sort of placemaking and events. Right now we're working on the Stroll in the Streets program or event that is going to be happening in October.
Okay.
And we're closing Lenore Street for one Sunday to cars, and we're just going to open it up to people, bikes and pedestrians, and all the way from Dix Park to Chavis Park. So we're very much sort of involved in that. So we do a whole lot of stuff, but I'm not sure a third grader would understand anything that I just said, but maybe
that's fair. I don't think we have any third graders listening, but just for my own understanding of, right. I mean, I think it's always been amazing to me as someone who has never been in the public sector to learn about all the different things and all the different groups and all the different people that are touching the shaping of this city, both public and private. But I've had more exposure to the private side, so the public side, just it always amazes me how much is going on within the city to help get things done. And there's, I mean, a ton of folks who do really great work and work really hard over long periods of time sometimes to get things done. So it always amazes me to learn more about that.
For sure.
So the ADU thing that you talked about, right, started in for you in Canada with laneway housing, and now, you know, you brought it back to your home state, this interest in accessory dwelling units and ADUs. So how would you define an accessory dwelling unit? And a question that came in from the newsletter from Tyler Kraft is what are typical uses for ADUs, either the ADUs that already exist in Raleigh or in other markets?
This is a more complicated answer than I think people usually expect. So ADUs are typically second homes on a property. Mm-hmm. The way the city of Raleigh defines it, and actually the way almost every other city defines ADUs, is simply that, a second home on a lot. There is no sort of technical distinction in defining ADUs that separates an ADU that is completely detached mm-hmm. from one that is attached to the home. So you might see somebody build a one-bedroom apartment that is attached to their main house. You might see somebody build a one-bedroom ADU in the backyard that is not attached to the house. So those are both ADUs technically, mm-hmm. and that's the way Raleigh's UDO, the Unified Development Ordinance, the zoning code, defines them. That's how most cities define them.
Is there a difference? And again, the thing I've seen what makes it a dwelling unit as opposed to, you know, basically a finished room over a garage with a bathroom and a bed. Is there a difference between what an ADU contains? You know, I've always kind of heard of a bedroom, a bathroom, and a stove. Like you can have 2 out of the 3, but the day you get 3 out of 3, now you're a dwelling unit.
A dwelling unit. Yeah, so I think, you know, I'd have to check the official definitions in the UDO for what Raleigh says, but a kitchen, I think, is important. I think that's the one thing that turns an otherwise accessory use mm-hmm. into an ADU. I think a bathroom, you can imagine, you know, the man cave, the stereotypical man cave probably has a bathroom in it, you know, but otherwise it's not really a dwelling unit. It's a place where people might have a studio, a home office mm-hmm. with a bathroom, but the moment you put a kitchen in it, you make it a sort of livable unit. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really what we're talking about here. For a long time in Raleigh, when ADUs were not legal, it seemed like people were building accessory structures with a bathroom and maybe having a hot plate. Mm-hmm. Don't want to speculate too much, but perhaps sneaking a small kitchen in there unpermitted. Definitely don't want to advocate for that, nor do we have to today. But that's what an ADU is. As to how they're used, it's a good question.
Well, just to pause for a second, you brought up an interesting point that I don't think we've covered yet. We're talking today about, you know, advocating for ADUs, but there was a time historically that, I mean, this is not a new thing, right? So ADUs were or are on the ground today. ADUs exist in Raleigh, and they mm-hmm. did for a long time, and mm-hmm. then stopped. And so now this is a reoccurrence or bringing back ADUs as opposed to okay. And so I think that is important to note. And so of the ADUs that exist in Raleigh today, do you have a sense of what they're currently being used for?
We do not have a great idea of how existing ADUs are being used. It is our goal to conduct a census mm-hmm. of pre-existing ADUs that existed before these last couple of years, this flurry of ADU regulation and whatnot. That would involve us, and this is something Seattle, I think, attempted to do in their monitoring program, and I'm not sure how successful they were, but that would involve us basically doing a bit of sort of behind the scenes work in GIS to try and find out, what parcels in Raleigh might have an ADU. So we're looking for parcels that have 2 dwelling units on them that probably have some sort of second, either a detached unit or maybe an internal second unit. If we can narrow down that field to, a few thousand lots, then we can easily sort of send out surveys to those property owners and say, would you be willing to answer some questions about this second unit on your property? Is it an ADU? Are you renting it out? Or is it home office and it's not a dwelling unit? That sort of thing. We're always relying on people returning surveys in that respect. And, planners,
which I imagine is a challenge.
It is a challenge. I think planners, like everybody else who tries to do surveys, we typically don't get the response rate that we would like.
Right.
But that's for pre-existing ADUs. We have in place now a monitoring program in Raleigh that is modeled after something that Seattle has done to better understand how they're being used. And fortunately, the folks at the city who intake permit applications for new homes, including ADUs, are the same people who intake applications for short-term rentals. So we will know our first report out. We're going to be reporting this out every 18 months, along with all of the other reporting about housing coming on the heels of the missing middle text change this summer. The city has made it a goal to sort of understand the effects and impacts of the missing middle text change, the ADU text change, the tiny house text change, cottage courts, all that. So we want to know, how many duplexes are being built, how many triplexes, quads, how many ADUs are being built. We're going to know how many are used for short-term rentals. We're going to know where they're located. So the sort of second layer of information that we hope to get is we're creating a questionnaire, a survey that the intake staff will give to applicants, asking questions, how much are you going to rent this thing for? Are you renting this out short-term, long-term? If so, what are your rental rates? What are the nightly rates? What are the monthly rates? Where are you parking this? Are you providing parking on site? Are you providing parking? Is there parking in the street? Did you cut any trees down? We want to know the sort of environmental impacts of ADUs, and if they're negatively impacting the canopy, this will tell us in 18 months, or 36 months if we need to sort of reconfigure some of these standards to make sure that the ADU policies and regulations are having the intended effects.
Well, so, but high level, I would think, so we've talked about a couple of uses. There's long-term rental. There's short-term rental. I've seen home offices and studios potentially. Are there any other main uses that you see or have seen for folks for ADUs?
Yeah, there are all kinds of uses for ADUs, and maybe this is a good time to sort of talk about the niche in the housing supply market that ADUs provide. So yes, you might build an ADU because you see it as an opportunity to make additional income, either from short-term rental or long-term rental. There are people who probably do that, and that's something that is going to occur. I think probably more often than not, somebody is interested in building an ADU as a home for a specific person or kind of person. And so one niche that ADUs fill that really can't be replicated by, many other kinds of housing is aging in place sort of housing. And so the sort of prototypical example of this is, let's say there's a couple, they've been living in a neighborhood for 30 years. They're retired, got maybe some mobility issues, can't get around as easily as they can. They own a 2-story house that's 2,000 square feet, or even a 2,000 square foot 1-story house. They want to stay in their neighborhood, but they can't really keep up their big main house, nor do they really need all that space. So they might build an ADU, move into that ADU, and then rent the main house out, either to somebody just looking for a place to live, or maybe a family member who can help take care of them. You might have, that same couple might just build the ADU so that they can have a caretaker live in the ADU and to help take care of them. Another use for ADUs that really can't be replicated by other forms is, adults who have adult children who can't take care of themselves for whatever reason. If they've got developmental issues, graduated from college and can't find a job and it's too expensive for them, can't afford a place to live, that's a place for those people to live. We've mentioned short-term rentals. The caretaker thing is something that's actually been on the books in North Carolina for quite some time. In Raleigh, previous to all this ADU work that we've done in the city, you could actually build an ADU for healthcare purposes. The silly thing is that it would have to be moved 6 months after that care provision had stopped.
How do you move an ADU?
Which is why they were never
removed.
Which is why...
Because I'm guessing, was mobile an option? I mean, could you plop a camper
No, you
in the
can't.
backyard?
You cannot put a manufactured home today in your backyard as an ADU.
So what then? I mean, it sounds to me, in the conversations I've been hearing, that there's some questions on twofold. Of one, these ADUs are going to be built everywhere and all over the place and kind of disrupt the housing ecosystem. There's this other question of, housing affordability and attainability. And I think it seems to me that, the question is always, well, compared to what? So, short-term rentals can happen in most neighborhoods now, within the home, right? So if you're not really adding much availability for short-term rental because the short-term rental already exists. As far as aging in place in these alternate units and uses, the sense to me is, like you said, they're kind of purpose built. I mean, if you wanted to own a rental unit, if you were an investor and looking to build a portfolio of rental units, my guess is there are simpler and less expensive ways to go about that. You could go buy a rental home, single family home, townhome, condo, whatever. So again, that exists already. So let's talk then about, where do you see and kind of what does adoption look like in other markets? And so we've got 500,000 people in Raleigh. And you and I were talking about before the recording. We can look this up, or someone can comment if they know the exact numbers. But there's roughly 250,000 dwelling units in Raleigh proper today. What do you think this kind of, what does the adoption look like?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is a concern that we hear and have heard for a long time, is that by allowing ADUs, we're going to open up the floodgates, and everybody's backyard is going to be occupied with an ADU, and density is going to double, and so on and so forth. The data from cities that have had ADUs on the books for decades or more shows quite clearly that at their highest uptake levels, we can expect that 2% of a city's permits for dwelling units might be ADUs.
So that's new permits. That's not existing stock.
Not existing stock. We don't know exactly how many ADUs we have in Raleigh today. I would expect it's a lot higher than most people think. Every neighborhood built in this country before the 50s is going to have ADUs in them, particularly those built in the early part of the 20th century. Many, many, many ADUs. If you go through Oakwood, Mordecai, Boylan Heights, you see lots of ADUs. The maximum uptake for any city is going to be about 2%, right? So in Raleigh, that means, we've got about 11,000 housing units a year maybe being built. We're talking about at most 200 ADUs per year citywide. not the kind of density that you're really going to see on the ground. I mean, when you're spread that out across the city of Raleigh, you know, not going to have a huge sort of visual impact or impact on parking. At least we think so. So that's 2% is basically the number that we're seeing.
And that's if everything goes
swimmingly.
I mean, that's the high end.
I think that the cities that have had the highest uptake levels of ADUs are Portland and Seattle, and now Los Angeles has become the number one ADU city in the country in terms of the number of units being built. So if we were to reach those kinds of levels, 200 ADUs per year would be, you know, knocking it out of the park.
Right, and even if you double, that's 400 a year.
400 a year, even if we, and that would make Raleigh the most ADU friendly city in the country, if not North America.
You know, we've got 200 units coming on into the market, you know, in a year going forward. Yeah. What is the rental, you know, again, and you've talked some about these are kind of purpose-built units, but if they are being rented, do you have any sense of what those rental rates look like and how they compare in other markets?
Yeah. This is another good question. So we know that ADUs can be affordable housing. We never say that they are affordable housing. I mean, we were talking a little bit ago about, you know, you might have an ADU built in a neighborhood like 5 Points in Raleigh that is an expensive neighborhood, relatively expensive neighborhood, and that ADU might rent for, you know, $1,000 or even $2,000, which is not necessarily an affordable housing unit. We do know, however, that in Portland, 15% of accessory dwelling units are rented free of charge. Mm-hmm. There is no rent. These are mostly family members, obviously, living in these ADUs. What I was speaking a bit about earlier, we know from San Francisco that 19% of ADUs rent for about 19% lower rent than comparable rental units in the same neighborhood. Anecdotally, I have a friend who a few years ago was actually looking for an ADU as an apartment, and they were looking in Oakwood, and they found one in Oakwood that was renting. This was 4 years ago, I want to say, for $600.
Yeah.
You cannot find an apartment for rent for $600 within that distance of downtown Raleigh anywhere today. Right. So, you know, at the same time, there might be an ADU across the street from that one in Oakwood that's renting for triple that. Mm-hmm. We don't know. But on the issue of affordability, and this is something we hear a lot from the community, is, you know, these aren't going to be affordable units. They're not going to help us with that part of the housing crisis. And sure, there's no way for us to ensure that all ADUs will be affordable. I think there are some interesting ADU programs across the country that have targeted affordability, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But you also hear this about missing middle housing. Well, missing middle housing is not going to be affordable. The rental rates are not going to be affordable. Well, we don't often hear that about single family housing development. You know, why should the affordability onus be on accessory dwelling units, duplexes, quads, but not on single family houses? And so that is a point of frustration, I think, with people who are in this housing field. Mm-hmm. So that's something we constantly talk about. But, you know, I think the fact of the matter is that most ADU owners are probably not looking to make, you know, money hand over fist. Right.
They're not going to be institutional investment.
Yes,
you know, decision makers.
Most ADU developers today building the one-off ADU, even if they're building it for supplemental rental income, will probably not have their eyes on the, you know, apartment rental rates in their neighborhood to make sure that they're making the maximum that they could. They're probably going to set the rent at a rate to attract the kind of person that they want to live in that in that home. And you know, you might think, you know, let's take an example of, let's say there's a single, you know, older folk living in a neighborhood, and let's say it's a single woman, and They just want, to have somebody else around
Mm-hmm.
on in their neighborhood or on their property, and maybe just a little bit of security. They might intentionally seek out to have somebody younger on living on their property,
Mm-hmm.
just to have a second sort of set of eyes on their property, or just somebody to talk to during the day, that sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
and they're probably not looking to make a ton of money off of that.
No, I think that's and we talked a bit about this before the recording started, of kind of, I think a lot of time when there's kind of, and I'll air quotes this, but new, solutions or new changes coming. And again, these exist already. I mean, they're all over the place. I see them, you see them. That the kind of the onus does fall on them to be this silver bullet solution. And I do think, the 5 Points example is a great one. If you're looking to move to 5 Points and your options are currently to buy a house or rent a house, you're probably going to be looking at a very large rental number or a very large purchase price. And so again, this isn't saying, oh, well, you'll be able to move into a market where the rents are $2,500 or $3,000 and you're going to be paying $500.
That's right.
It's saying this gives you an option that's less expensive, more attainable than the alternate options. And it does that through both size and kind of function.
That's right.
And it does that through pricing. So again, I think all of this is going to be market rate housing. These aren't going to be subsidized in any way that I know of, other than just personal ambivalence, which, to your point, exists. I mean, it exists today. And so it's interesting to me that, again, this isn't the silver bullet solution, but you will have, I think, alternate options. And again, if you're one person looking to move into a neighborhood, if I wanted to move into 5 Points by myself, my option today is to rent a house or to live in a bedroom, share a room or share a house with somebody, have roommates. But again, this is just providing an alternate, which I think is fascinating. It's not going to be a silver bullet solution, but I do think it's an interesting addition to the landscape.
Yeah, and I really do. I want to say again that the role that ADUs play, the niche that they fill in the housing market, is incredibly important, right? I mean, as an aging in place strategy, it's hard to find a better solution for somebody who wants to stay in their neighborhood. Maybe their housing costs are too high, or they can't keep up their house. ADUs are the sort of gold standard for them. If you have an adult child who you need to take care of, gold standard.
Right.
If you want to stay in your neighborhood and you need to have them close.
Well, it brings back the importance, I think, and we talk about this in lots of different ways, but it's this diversity of housing stock that you don't.
That's right.
I mean, again, I don't know of another solution that meets that need. If you want to live in a neighborhood and all of the homes are fairly similar, whether it's 5 Points or West Raleigh, you don't have many choices. And so this is a way to add choices and allow for potential solutions. And again, from the adoption, we've seen the numbers aren't through the roof, and I think that's because, again, this is one piece of a much larger housing ecosystem and housing challenge that we're facing. So I think it's an interesting thing. And again, it's interesting to me if and when we can get the data to look back and say, okay, well, what did the delivery look like when ADUs were completely legal, back in the 50s and 60s. Right. They weren't building thousands a year, but they were where they were needed and where they were helpful and where they were beneficial. They were built. So what about process? Where are we in the kind of timeline of things?
The very brief history of ADUs in Raleigh is that, yes, we talked about they were very common first half of the 20th century. After the war, single-family housing exploded across the country. And along with single-family housing, in a lot of places, including Raleigh, came a prohibition on building second units, accessory dwelling units. There's a very sort of ugly history here of sort of anti-renter and even anti-black sort of policy here, which I think is a whole other ADU episode, just talking about how ADUs have played a role in this sort of racial history of housing in this country. We fast forward then to, 2009, Raleigh's comprehensive plan. I think it actually, I could be wrong about this, but I think the comprehensive plan recommends that the city try and find ways to promote accessory dwelling units. I can double check that. Your listeners can double check that.
We'll find out one way or the other.
Either way, about 6 years after the comp plan came out, we had a group of residents from Mordecai, just north of downtown, who were interested in building ADUs. They were not legal at the time. So we sort of coordinated this study with some members of the Mordecai community. Now is probably a good time to give a shout out to Tom Barry, who's an architecture professor at NC State School of Design, who was and continues to be, I think, instrumental in this world of ADUs. Look him up if you don't know Tom. He's great. Good to talk to you about ADUs. We conducted a study, and at the time, the city council had a lot of hesitation about accessory dwelling units and the impacts that they could have in neighborhoods. And so the city's approach then was to allow ADUs, but only in areas that sort of selected to have what we called an accessory dwelling unit overlay district applied to their neighborhood. It was a unique program. There's no other city in the country, to my knowledge, that has only allowed ADUs in an overlay format. Some cities allow ADUs through a special use permit, but
the difference being the overlay requires the vote of
the overlay was going to
versus
10 acres, and you had to have a certain amount of property owners. I want to say you had to get 25% of property owners, and then 50% of that 25% had to say yes. I could have the numbers wrong.
But the overlay, the special use permit would say, I'm going directly to staff and saying, hey, I've got this site. Here's where I want to put it. Is this okay? And you say yes or no. So
that's
it's
right.
A smaller, I guess, control group, for lack of a better word.
Much smaller. And I think there are a few cities in North Carolina who still only allow ADUs through a special use permit. The general trend, I will say, in cities across the country and North America for that matter, is to permit ADUs as of right on any residential property. In fact, it's state law now in California. Every town and city has to permit ADUs, up to 2 ADUs, in fact. And some cities are taking it further and allowing multiple detached ADUs on a property. Anyhow, so we had a change in city council leadership. The newer council was, I think, much more in favor of accessory dwelling units. And so they made the decision to scrap the overlay and to allow ADUs as of right, which is a sort of term of art. As of right just means anybody can build an ADU on their property. So that's where we are today, and we've simply said you can build an ADU on your property. Now, you and I were talking a bit ago about homeowners associations and their role in this, and we can get into that later if you want to. But for the most part, today, if you want to build an ADU on your property, as long as your property meets the minimum size requirements for an ADU, you can have one.
So that was I guess, from a timing question, is that's today. I mean, this is live. This is not still in debate today or review.
Last summer, the city council got rid. 2020. City council got rid of the overlay. We also, I would say, liberalized some of the standards. So, changed the size of properties that could accommodate ADUs. Just basically wanted to make it easier to build an ADU, and you can now build an ADU in any residential district in the city.
Do you have a sense of how many ADUs have been permitted?
Permitted since then. So last year, let's say council, I think, got rid of the overlay in July. And should say that the overlay was probably going to preclude ADU construction at all. So after the overlay was removed, in those 6 months, we had 13 permits pulled.
And is that so? With the overlay, were any permits pulled?
No.
Okay, so it went from
Not
0
to my knowledge,
to 13.
There were no overlays. There were a few people who started the process.
I guess that's true. So no overlays were even established.
No overlays
much less
were established.
Pulled.
There were a few people who began the process and quickly discovered that they did not have the time or money to undertake this. with a rezoning, you're typically hiring a lawyer.
Yeah.
You're typically going door to door in this case.
Engineering consultant, right.
Or an engineering consultant, and going door to door and asking people if they'll support an overlay about ADUs. And a lot of people have no idea what any of that is. And
so back to, I mean, costs of an ADU, right? There's the physical, I mean, there's the monetary costs, there's the time, but right, there's this kind of onerous requirements that and hurdles that make it hard for something in the end. So from a development is hard as is. As a professional, as a layperson,
it's very intimidating.
Yeah.
Very intimidating. The good news is that in the first 6 months, the good news, if you like ADUs, that is that in the first 6 months of 2021, we had, I want to say 35 to 40 permits pulled for ADUs, which would put us on track for about 70 this year if those numbers sort of stay the same for the subsequent months.
Which again, so I mean that's
it's good.
Close to a 0.7% of our overall permits being pulled. But again, I think it's encouraging to see an actual reaction from citizens, and so one is, people question, well, is this beneficial? Is this helpful? Is this something that the city needs? Is this a change? And you say, well, okay, yeah, there's things actually happening. And we did touch on it briefly, but HOAs. So again, you and I were talking about this, which I think is fascinating. If I live in an HOA, which I do, the rules and regulations of my HOA supersede, is that the right word? Are stronger than the rules of the city. So the city can say, yes, Jed, you can build an ADU on your lot. My HOA can say no.
This is
and
correct.
I can't do anything about it.
Correct. Okay. And, I have not read through the rules of any HOA for that matter, but, obviously not all of them, to know how many HOAs in the city prohibit accessory dwelling units. Mm-hmm. I would guess that a good percentage, if not all, of HOAs in the city of Raleigh have some language that prohibits second units on a property, which would include ADUs. Mm-hmm. This also goes for missing middle housing. And so when we talk about missing middle housing proliferating through the city, we have to understand that for the most part, HOAs are going to preclude duplexes and quads being built in those neighborhoods. And
any neighborhood built after the 60s or 70s is likely part of an HOA. And again,
that's right.
I don't think my HOA documents preclude or say anything about ADUs, but I'm willing to bet since they don't say anything about ADUs, that means I can't do it. And if you get past that, then there's the architectural review committees and there's all sorts of other hurdles. It's again, I think on a adoption basis, even if this is citywide, it's probably not a majority of acreage of developed neighborhoods.
Very small. Very small part of Raleigh's neighborhoods.
So then what, kind of talk to me about hurdles as you see or have seen in other markets or see here that, what stops people who want to build an ADU from building an ADU, and, what are those hurdles and what is the city doing about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is actually the question that City Council asked us directly last year after they got rid of the overlay. They said, well, what are the other barriers to building ADUs, to incentivizing ADUs in Raleigh, and how can we get more of them? And we undertook, the Urban Design Center and with the planning department, undertook a study of basically the best practices across the country in terms of both regulating ADUs, but also creating incentive programs for ADUs. And so we spent a few months looking at what's being done in California, where ADUs are being strongly encouraged, what's being done in Portland, which has long been the sort of ADU poster child. What about Seattle, which has very similar sort of growth challenges as Raleigh, where the housing costs are super high? What about Atlanta, which is a sort of as a other southeastern city with a growing population and increasing housing costs? What are they doing with ADUs? What is Asheville? What are Durham doing? So we identified all sorts of programs and things that could reduce the barriers to ADUs. And so what are the barriers to ADUs? So the primary barrier to an ADU is the cost of building one. And we have to be honest here and say that It is expensive to build an ADU.
Mhm.
It's going to cost, especially, in the last year and a half, we've seen construction costs increase so much. You're probably talking to build, a modest 600 square foot ADU, maybe $200,000. You could probably build them cheaper. You can definitely build them more in a more expensive manner. Aside from cost, there's, like you mentioned a bit ago, most people who are building ADUs are sort of novice homeowners. They're not developers. They're sort of doing a one-off project. It's intimidating. I mean, you have to go through the permitting process with the city. You typically are hiring an architect, got to hire a contractor, that sort of thing. It's a daunting process. So cost, always the biggest barrier. There is some neighborhood opposition. I think now, if you want to build an ADU, your neighborhood can't necessarily stop you unless you've got an HOA or there's immense pressure on you otherwise. But those are significant barriers, and so we looked at ways that other cities have tried to tackle this affordability problem with ADUs. Found some really interesting models. We looked at ways that cities are doing things like reducing setback requirements for ADUs in order to make it a little bit easier for them to build. Even the sort of monitoring program that Seattle has undertaken and that we are sort of modeling our own program after is all meant to sort of understand, like, what are the barriers? Why are ADUs being built? Why are they not being built? What can we do to further sort of reduce some of those barriers? Would love to sort of talk about some of these affordability programs, these anti-displacement programs. So,
go for it.
We were talking a bit about affordability, and so there are programs that other cities have undertaken and that we are looking at in Raleigh now, very much in the nascent stage, and I don't think the city can commit to definitely implementing these programs, at least in the short term. So there's a few programs that I want to sort of talk about. So Santa Cruz, California, has a program called My House, My Home, which was sort of through a partnership with Habitat for Humanity. And so this is a program that was intentionally aimed at preventing displacement of residents in quickly gentrifying neighborhoods. We can provide links to the great website that Santa Cruz has created. They have some really great testimonial sort of videos for this. Basically, I'll use one example of a participating homeowner in this case. So in Santa Cruz, the city identified an elderly couple, black couple in a gentrifying neighborhood who very much wanted to stay in their neighborhood, but did have some of those mobility challenges, couldn't get, up the stairs to get in their house, so on and so forth. Didn't want to move, didn't think they could afford anywhere else in their city where they very much wanted to stay. And so they contacted, the city. They agreed to participate in this program. And so how that worked was Habitat for Humanity comes in. They help provide, and I think it was a $80,000 3% simple interest loan. Habitat builds the house for the family. The loan is deferrable for up to 30 years. It can be payable upon sale or transfer, or you can start paying it back after those 30 years. But in this case, this elderly couple, they're probably in the 60s or 70s. They actually ended up moving into the newly built one-floor ADU, and their daughter, who basically is their caretaker and part-time healthcare provider, and her family moved into their primary house. They did pay rent. In this case, there is a 60% AMI rent requirement, so area median income. So in Santa Cruz, that's quite high, but nonetheless, that is an affordable housing unit that is being provided, and these folks got to stay in their neighborhood. So that's one model where Habitat comes in with a loan and construction. There's another model from Los Angeles, which is called La Mas Backyard Homes Project. And this one is interesting because Self-Help Federal Credit Union was very much a partner in this, along with another sort of financing group from Southern California. And so one issue with ADUs across the country, including Raleigh, is that most banks, almost all banks for that matter, will not provide somebody a loan to construct an ADU, primarily because they do not take into account and will not take into account the sort of projected rental income from that ADU. So you build an ADU and you think you're going to get $1,500 in rent each month from that.
Right.
Well, the banks don't really care, at least
Which is very bizarre given the fact that as a developer, you can get a loan from a bank for the exact same thing.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Nevertheless, this is the case. Tangent. This is why so many cities, including Raleigh, are focused on flag lots as well as a way to get second units built.
What's a flag lot?
A flag lot is pause the pod to talk about flag lots. So a flag lot is when you take a property and you subdivide it to create two fee simple lots.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those lots typically is shaped like a flag. Most cities
so narrow walkway from the front to the back and it expands.
Yeah, because most cities require a lot to have some street frontage.
Can't
and so you have a driveway that is connected to the street, and let's say it's 12 feet wide, and that driveway goes all the way to the back of that lot, where the lot then widens out. So if you look at it from an aerial view, it looks like
it's a flagpole and a flag.
It's a flagpole and a flag.
And so with that, would then the bank look at a fee simple property with a home on it,
That's
ADU
right.
or otherwise, is now basically a rental unit.
Yeah, it's no longer an
unit.
accessory dwelling unit.
Yeah.
It's a primary dwelling unit that can either be sold,
Yeah.
or it can be rented. It can be owned by anybody and rented out. So flag lots, that's something we're also working on in the city. If folks are interested, they can expect us to sort of report back to council on this in a couple months about flag lots.
Very cool.
Very likely to be a text change to enable flag lots in the next 6 months to a year. So,
but also from an anti-displacement strategy, if you have
Yep.
a big backyard and
Yep.
you can establish a flag lot, build a home, move into that home.
Yeah.
And again, from a diversity, if you live in a neighborhood and all the homes are exactly the same, the chances, and you're in the situation you mentioned earlier, the chances of you finding another home in the neighborhood that meets that need, that can have an adult child and aging parents, that's one story, that has a master on the first floor, so it's very impractical. And so can you create your own solution?
Yeah.
That's kind of what's being presented here. You have the option to create your own solution as opposed to having no options.
That's right. And for people who are facing, let's say people who are on a fixed income,
Mm-hmm.
older folks, retired, on a fixed income in a gentrifying neighborhood where the property taxes are going up and up,
Mm-hmm.
the cost to maintain their house is going up and up, especially in a gentrifying neighborhood where there's sort of this pressure to maintain your property in a certain way,
Mm-hmm.
keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. It can be very expensive. And so if you're that kind of household, maybe you've got some equity built up in your house. Well, if you can subdivide and sell part of your lot,
Mm-hmm.
you can either take that infusion of cash and pay down your mortgage, pay down your debt. Maybe you've got healthcare debt or something,
Mm-hmm.
pay that down, or just save it for your retirement. I mean, this is a lot of people in Raleigh are in this situation. They're sort of house rich and cash poor is one.
So your value has gone way up, but you can't do anything until you sell. And if you
That's
have no
right.
place to go,
That's
you
right.
can't sell.
That's right. And I think this is exactly what places like Santa Cruz and LA and Denver, which I'll talk about in a second, this is exactly the issue that they have recognized is happening in their cities. So what self-help did is, recognizing that most banks won't provide a loan to construct an ADU, they created a new loan product basically to build ADUs. These are for homeowners who sort of lack that equity, can't put up that kind of collateral that banks require to get, construction loans to build an ADU. The credit union self-help was also now willing, as part of this product, to consider that potential rental income.
Interesting.
They considered, I think they were willing to look at 75% of the projected rental income. which is important. I mean, want to stress that. And so these new loans could then be used to construct an ADU. There are affordability requirements with those. Any ADU constructed as part of this would have to be kept. I think it was, I want to say 60%, maybe 80%. One last piece, because there was so much risk involved in these loans, there was a sort of guarantee, a supplemental guarantee provided by a grant from JP Morgan Chase. It's sort of this floating $650,000 grant that the JP Morgan gave to the city of LA to sort of guarantee these self-help loans, right? So that's one way to sort of safeguard this program.
Right,
so,
offset some of the perceived risk.
Yeah, exactly. The third program, and this is the one that I actually really love the most, is called Denver Stay in Place.
Mm-hmm.
We can, again, link to their website, I guess on Jed's Twitter account.
Please.
So this is actually a community land trust model, and I'm really excited about this one. I'm very much a proponent of community land trust generally. We have one here in Raleigh who's growing. You had
Rhett was on the podcast.
Rhett, a friend of the pod, Rhett.
That's right.
Was here to talk about this issue recently. So in Denver with the Stay in Place program, basically what happens is you've got that same kind of homeowner at risk of displacement. Community land trust comes in, buys the land from underneath the homeowner. The owner retains ownership of the building, of the home itself. The homeowner can then receive funding, or the CLT will help build an accessory dwelling unit on that property. The ADU is retained under the ownership of the primary property owner. So they can then rent that out and receive that supplemental income. Both of these homes, though, are perpetually affordable.
As part of the CLT.
If not permanently affordable, right? So same community land trust model. There's now 2 homes on this lot. The lot is owned by the land trust and the homes are owned by the property owner. And density is increased. You've created and again, there's affordability requirements for that second unit.
Well, and as a solution and as an option, what we talked about with Red is if you have pent up value in your property, in your land, or the land price is, the land value is going up substantially, you can't do anything about it.
That's right.
While you're still there, unless the land trust comes in and buys it from you at market value, and then I mean, it's an option, and in life, usually options
an option that allows that household to stay in their neighborhood that they love, to continue living with the neighbors that they've grown up with,
to allow a new person or family or group to move into that neighborhood,
to allow a new person who maybe doesn't want to live in a 5/1 apartment building in downtown Raleigh. Maybe they prefer the sort of quieter neighborhood setting, and they move into the ADU. So this is those are 3 programs that
we're
very much interested in. Stay tuned. We are taking a sort of longer look at these anti-displacement affordable programs, just because they are so complex. If we ever have to engage with self-help or a group like self-help, that's obviously going to take some time to help sort of create that sort of mortgage product, construction loan product.
That's right. So if folks want to learn more, where's the best place to go about ADUs?
So you should very much stay tuned. Immediately you can go to the City of Raleigh's website.
Okay.
But here's where I'm gonna lodge a bit of criticism at my own workplace and myself for this. I think is that the city's website for ADUs is very technical, and it's oriented to very much sort of probably like a contractor. If a contractor went to the city's ADU website, they would very much be able to understand, here's the permitting information, here are the setbacks, so on and so forth. If you're just a lay person, you don't know what ADUs, or you're worried about ADUs, you want to build an ADU, but you have no experience building anything, it's not going to help you too much. And so one thing that we very much learned in this study we did last year was that those cities that are experiencing, I think, the greatest uptake of ADUs are creating websites and other resource guides that lay it out simply, for all types of members of the community. What is an ADU? Should you be concerned? If you are concerned, these are the issues. If you want to build one and you're a homeowner, if you want to build one and you're a tract home developer, these are the rules. We are completely revamping the city's web presence for ADUs. Within a couple months, we're going to have this live. It's going to be evolving over probably the next few years as we create more and more incentives and programs for ADUs. Check it out. I will also share with Jed so he can post the links to, I think it's San Mateo County, California has, I cannot stress it, one of the coolest websites for any planning, anything that I've ever seen. They have a great cost calculator that will tell you, how expensive it will be to construct your ADU based on what town in that county you live on and construction costs, and it's very up to date. So we're hoping to very much do that same kind of thing. So you'll be able to go to the website, and if you're a homeowner and you want to build an ADU and you live in Southeast Raleigh, we'll hopefully have that kind of calculator, and we'll have all the rules, and it will be very, very easy and attractive. And I think we'll tell the story of ADUs and about, why we think they're important. But for the immediately, check out the city's website. There's a whole host of great information on ADUs on the web that we can link to. Very
cool. Well, I appreciate those links. And Charles, I appreciate your time. Is there anything kind of you wish we brought up but didn't? And then lastly, is there anything that you would recommend people go out and do in regards to ADUs?
Yeah. So we have not, I think we touched on it a little bit, but there are people who are, I would say, concerned, if not opposed to ADUs. And I think it's important for advocates of ADUs to listen to those folks. Absolutely. And to sort of understand what the concerns are. There are legitimate concerns. Right. I think particularly there are sort of segments of traditionally Black neighborhoods who are opposed to ADUs. We have to sort of understand why that is. As a white cis male planner, urbanist type, I think I have a lot of blind spots, and I think a lot of us do. One of those concerns, I've heard this many times, is that ADUs were houses for the help or for servants, back in the day, 100 years ago. And so there's this kind of ugly racial component to ADUs, at least in some people's minds. And I think we have to address that. And I think we can't just simply ignore that or say that we're not creating, servants' quarters here. I think we have to have that dialogue and sort of talk to people about, their concerns and how ADUs might or might not be what they think they are. I think that's one issue that I think probably deserves its whole other sort of pod about, opposition to missing middle housing in general in certain segments of the community.
I'll take a second to plug. I mean, for folks who haven't read it, but The Color of Law, again, as a white male, and Blind Spots, if you haven't read that book, highly suggested you do, because again, I think for a portion surely of this population who's listening, these are things that aren't a concern or are maybe coming up for the first time, right? So this idea of having help live in the back of the house, or these perceptions or realities historically of planning and regulation around the built environment have been horrendous in many cases. And so it's not something to be taken lightly. It's not something to be ignored. It's something to be discussed and addressed, because it's a very real, planning decisions have historically had outweighed impacts on certain groups of the population. And if you're not in that group of population, you probably don't see it or think about it. And that's a problem.
I would just encourage folks who want to learn more about ADUs to reach out to the Urban Design Center, reach out to the planning department. If anybody wants to have any one-on-one conversations about ADUs, we'd be happy to do that. Would love to take a stroll through some neighborhoods in Raleigh with folks who want to check out ADUs. We're always looking for ways to sort of partner with groups like AIA or whatever to help sort of spread the word. Look at California, look at other states and cities that have had ADUs on the books for much longer and see sort of what role they're playing. And again, want to stress, and I think we've talked about this, that ADUs are not a silver bullet. They're not a panacea. They're ultimately going to have a relatively very small role to play in the housing market. But again, the niche that they fill is not replaceable by any other kind of housing. So let's find ways to make ADUs possible and show that they can be a positive contribution to people's neighborhoods.
Yeah, possible again. And that's one of the things, one of my suggestions, as you were saying it, was like, right, go walk through some of these neighborhoods from the 40s and 50s and earlier. But the problem is they don't stick out like a sore thumb. Like you and I know what we're looking for, know how to find them. You gotta have to look. And that's one of the interesting points to bring up is like, if they were so visible, if they were such a nuisance, if they were such a problem, you would know. I mean, you know where the problem areas are in your street, on your neighborhood. You know where the potholes are. You know where the issues are. You don't know where the non-issues are. And so again, when you walk through some of these older neighborhoods, Oakwood, Mordecai, wherever, 5 Points, I mean, you see, if you're looking, all sorts of stuff. But if you're not, it's kind of hard to see the duplex, triplex, the multi-unit apartment building that exists in some of these neighborhoods. And I think that's kind of the point.
It is very much the point. People use this term. I don't use it too much, but gentle density is a term that people use to describe ADUs and the role they play. And yeah, they're very small units that fit into these neighborhoods. Can't even see them most of the time. Don't even know that they're there. I think, one interesting fact about Raleigh, when you compare Raleigh to places like Portland and Seattle, is we actually have much larger backyards here than those cities. So we potentially could have many more ADUs without even knowing that they're there in Raleigh, just because of our backyards are so large. Right. So yeah, I'm encouraged by how the community has sort of taken to ADUs. That said, I think we'd like to get these incentive programs in place, get these barriers out of the way, and then move on to different kinds of housing and how we can sort of create this and create with the community a sort of fuller spectrum of options, of housing options. That's
awesome, Charles. I appreciate your time. Thank you for all that you've been doing for the years. Definitely something we want to keep track of and watch the uptake and help participate in that conversation. So thank you for your time and look forward to talking soon.
Yeah, it was great talking to you, Jed. Thanks.
I hope you guys enjoyed that conversation with Charles Dillard as much as I did. I love how it took twists and turns, and we talked about all sorts of different things regarding accessory dwelling units and the barriers and the different things that the city is doing to address those barriers. So I think we could have kept talking for hours and hours, and really enjoyed the time, and I'm really grateful for the time that Charles took to spend sharing his thoughts and his expertise on accessory dwelling units. As always, I'm so grateful that you have chosen to share this time with me. If you ever have any questions about Dirt NC or any land use related issues, you can reach out to me on Twitter at OakCityCRE. Also, if you're looking for a simple and straight to the point weekly update on commercial development in Raleigh, you can subscribe to my newsletter at www.oakcitycre.com. Until next time, thank you.